Our group decided to observe the potential correlation between female education and fertility. Our independent variable is the mean years of school attended by women of reproductive age, which is between the ages of 15 and 44, including primary, secondary, and tertiary education. Our dependent variable is the number of children that would be born to each woman with prevailing age specific fertility rates. The Gapminder world graph shows a clear worldwide trend down and to the right. Therefore, we believe that female education has a negative impact on fertility. We conducted a literature review and found many ways in which changes in female education lead to changes in fertility. In her study, Link Between Education and Fertility in Low and Middle Income Countries, Alina Pradhan notes that education increases women's understanding and access to family planning methods, increases the bargaining power of women within the household, increases participation in the labor market, and thereby increases the opportunity cost of bearing children, leads to smaller desired family size through ideational change, and improves access to health services for children and reduces infant mortality. It is important to acknowledge that there are alternative explanations for the data we observed. For example, in many countries, there is a rising cost of raising children that is deterring couples from having large families. While we acknowledge this and other possible explanations, we will remain focused on the influence of education. The graph shows us that the negative correlation between education and fertility is strong, but varies at different levels of education and stages in a country's development. We believe that this is due to the varying impacts of education on income, health, and knowledge, and their influence on fertility decisions. Even in 2009, African countries remained towards the top left of the graph. We found this interesting and focused our continued literature review on Africa. Norwegian economist Øystein Krabdahl found in his article Education and Fertility in Sub-Saharan Africa, Individual and Community Effects that the average fertility for 22 sub-Saharan African countries would be 1.00 lower if education were expanded from its current level to a country such as Kenya, which has a relatively high level of education for the area. This is important to consider when understanding the possible correlation between education levels and contraceptive usage. While sub Saharan Africa has a higher fertility rate than the rest of the world, which is also likely influenced by cultural factors such as religion and the long term economic benefits of having a child, the fertility rate may have likely decreased due to a higher level of education. In his article, Education and Fertility Evidence from a Policy Change in Kenya, Luke Ciccone examined a 1985 policy change in Kenya that lengthened primary school by 1 year. According to Ciccone, the reform led to an increase in education, a delay in marriage, and reduced fertility beginning at the age of 20. Furthermore, Ciccone found that the effect of fertility becomes increasingly negative through age 25. The findings suggest that postponement of marriage, reduction in the marital education gap, and increased early use of modern contraceptives contribute to reduced fertility. Beginning in 1985, the fertility rate in Kenya was 6.91 and the mean years in school was approximately 4.1 years. 10 years later, in order to account for the lag effect that may occur with the introduction of a new policy, the fertility rate dropped to 5.46 and the mean years in school was nearly at 6, a roughly 50% increase from the previous decade. Overall, Chaccone's evidence strongly suggests that an increase in schooling can lead to women having greater control over the household fertility decisions and ultimately lower levels of fertility. In a study done by Osili and Long, the impact of Nigerian free universal primary education, which increased student enrollment from 8.7 million in 1977 to 15 million in 1982, they found that by increasing female education by 1 year reduces early fertility, birth before the age of 25, by 0.26 births. By 1992, the fertility rate of Nigeria dropped from 6.74 to 6.4 after the mean years in school more than doubled from 1.7 to 3.8. Using Gapminder, the overwhelming majority of African countries have trended down and to the right on this graph since 1971. This trend can suggest a rather strong correlation between mean years in school for women of reproductive age and fertility rates in this region. Additional evidence that may be helpful to give us a better understanding of this relationship would be a piece on the cultural reasons for such high fertility rates in Africa relative to the rest of the world. When looking at the graph on Gapminder, on average, Africa has significantly higher fertility rates than both Asia and Europe, even among countries with similar levels of mean years in school. Using this information could help make better informed policy decisions going forward and also provide a better insight for decision makers. One country remained an outlier in terms of rapidly decreasing fertility rates while mean years of education grew slowly but steadily. In 1970, China's fertility rate was 5.75, among the highest in Asia, but by 1980 it had plummeted to 2.32. The reason behind this was the one child policy enacted in 1979, which mandated the Han Chinese, the country's ethnic majority, could only have one child in order to attempt to curb China's rapidly growing population. Considering the implications of bearing too many children above the economic capacity of an economy, we discussed health policy recommendations. In both developed and developing countries, women with more years of education have fewer babies than women with fewer years of education. Therefore, we believe that governments can complement their family planning programs with education reform.